We have talked about practice before. But here in the context of questions and answers is another critical time when we must practice. Well, how important is practice? It's so critical, I even practice for the impromptu, the unexpected. Mark Twain said it takes him 2 weeks to get ready just for an impromptu talk. Well, one part of a presentation that creates fear in many communicators is when we finish our prepared remarks, our talk, and then comes the Q&A, the question and answer session. It may seem that there's no way you can prepare for the unexpected, but you can. You can do this. I practice for Q&A as thoroughly as I practice the rest of the presentation, just to be prepared. And here's how you can do it. I ask friends and family and colleagues, people in the office, to spend a practice session with me, to pepper me with questions. If they aren't asking tough questions, I give them the tough questions. And here's the key. Try to identify the 5 or 6 most difficult questions that this audience can ask you about this subject. And then practice your answers before you get to the meeting. The idea is the more difficult the question, the more practice you need in answering. You don't want to practice on the audience. I insist in practice that my questioners not let me off the hook. I work until I'm well prepared to think on my feet, to handle the unknown, and to be comfortable. And that's the point of all my practice. It enables me to think on my feet. You can do that too. I always like to know how I'm going to respond to the 5 toughest questions I can imagine. I like to anticipate that worst case scenario, and then I'm prepared for them. Now, one of our ESI graduates is a man named David McClellan. He conducts training sessions for schools and colleges. He makes the case for practicing Q&A sessions better than I can. One day, David arrived to discover that the class he was intending to make a presentation to didn't want to hear his prepared presentation after all, but they wanted to have just a Q&A session. Well, David told me later that thanks to all his practice, he felt very comfortable doing an hour-long ad lib, even on the specific needs of the group, which were very difficult questions. And here's a direct quote from David. A little simple planning and practice turned a difficult speaking situation into just another day at the office. We can all say the same if we remember to practice. Now, some presenters really dread that Q&A time, but it's actually one of my favorite times in any presentation, if I practiced. I love the interaction with the audience. I love to hear what's on their minds. I especially love it when I get a question that maybe I've never quite heard before, but my practice allows me a lot of latitude. Now, here's some of the tips we give our ESI grads in the courses that make people like David so comfortable when they actually get out into the Q&A session. Might make a note of these. 1, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Remember our earlier discussion that being vulnerable adds to the effectiveness of our communications? Trying to be perfect is impossible? Well, here's the perfect time to remind the audience that even the most knowledgeable expert doesn't have all the answers and doesn't mind saying so. Now, when I'm faced with that situation, I always promise to find the answer. I then follow up with a call or maybe a note to the questioner, and by the way, I do it right away, and you can too. Another technique that works when you don't have the answer is to ask for input from the audience. Then this generates tremendous enthusiasm on their part. It often teaches me things that I need to know and will prove valuable for me later. And it gives them an opportunity to answer their own questions. And you're still there to be the traffic cop. Here's another idea. Answer a broad question with a specific answer, or a specific question with a broad answer. You have that choice. Here's an example of what I mean. If someone asks you what you believe will happen to the stock market, say over the next 10 years, well, that's a pretty broad question. Try to zero in on one area, such as tech stocks or e-trading. If someone asks how a certain political crisis is going to affect the stock market, you can push the subject out and talk in broader terms about how other world events have affected the market and affected all of us. Another idea, remember that this is a Q&A session and not an inquisition. You have rights too, you know. You've agreed to answer questions, but not to be interrogated. And if you're uncomfortable with what's happening, chances are the audience will be too. So if I'm getting grilled by someone in the audience, I respond not just to that questioner, but I try to include the whole audience instead of getting in that closed loop with the questioner who's asking that difficult question. I also try to keep in mind that there's a difference between a tough question and a hostile one. If I think of a question as hostile, I may respond with hostility, and then the audience chooses whose side they want to follow. So I remain as pleasant as possible when I respond to an unpleasant question. I even say, well, I'm glad that topic has come up. And so then you would answer it. But don't necessarily have to say that you're glad to hear that question. Another idea, don't be distracted by inappropriate questions. An example, Alice May, who's a friend who's written a book on marital problems, was recently asked in a forum, and they said, are you a Christian? Which is a question you often may hear, but this wasn't a religious presentation. Alice sometimes suggests spiritual solutions for troubled relationships. Of course, answering that question with either a yes or a no was bound to put off someone in that audience, and it wasn't appropriate. And that would detract from her ability to provide help to everyone there. Now, one alternative that she could have used was to suggest that she and the questioner discuss the matter later in private. Perfectly good response. Another, and by the way, this is the one Alice chose, was to explain that she found it worked best not to discuss her specific religious beliefs, so that all the listeners were free to use her suggestions within the framework of their own personal beliefs. Her response was well received. She moved on quickly to the next question. And I suggest to you, don't allow yourself to be pulled off track by questions that just don't fit your message or the setting. Here's one that's really important. All of these are, of course, but always, underscore the word always, repeat the question, even if they're just two or three of you, or if it's a large group. It's a good idea to paraphrase it when you repeat it. Now, this does several things. It clarifies the question for both you and the other members of the audience, making sure that everyone's on the same page. It also gives you the chance to think about your answer. By the way, another way to think about your answer is to pause and consider just taking a drink from your water bottle or your wow cup. I'm thinking. Here's another one. If the question is important, there's nothing wrong with planting it in the audience. Ask someone in the audience ahead of time to bring up a certain point if you want to make sure that that question gets asked. Nothing wrong with planting a question. Here's another. This is really important. Keep the energy level high. If questions aren't coming quickly, the energy drains away. Wrap it up. Don't linger, trying to drag out the last question on someone's mind. Instead, draw things to a close while the questions are still coming in strong. Comment that there's time for just one or two more questions, but that you'll be available after the session for further discussion. Then, Pat Boyd always suggests this in our ESI courses. Prepare a second close. Craft another powerful closing comment or two to follow a question and answer session. This brings the energy level back up, and that leaves the audience feeling good about that topic which you had addressed earlier. All of these steps give me the best possible shot at communicating effectively with my audience, even when we've moved into off-the-cuff dialogue. I suggest you practice that well. I look at it this way. I don't want to practice on my audience. I want to practice in my room and then be prepared with the best answers for my audience. Q&A, powerful, important.